Hello?
Yes.
Okay, so excuse me, please. I have asked that you all make sure that your mic is off. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Jindal Center for the Global South webinar session this afternoon. We'll make a start by presenting our special guest speaker for today, Professor Karori Singh. Professor Karori Singh is Emeritus Fellow at South Asia Center Studies Center in University of Rajasthan, India. Professor Singh has more than 37 years of teaching and research experience in University of Rajasthan, as I have mentioned, and during these years he had been the director of South Asia Studies Center, which is the oldest center of research on South Asia studies. Besides, he remained active in university administration, including member of syndicate in shaping academic and research orientation of social science and studies research. Professor Singh is as well an active member of various professional bodies and research organizations, including he is member of editorial board of national and international research journals. He had been chief of the research journal South Asian Studies. Professor Singh research interest area are agriculture, land reform, development policies. So today, Professor Singh will be sharing with us his expert opinion on poverty in South Asia. And as you all are aware, that poverty alleviation is the first and foremost goal of the South of the Sustainable Development Goals. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, now this topic has been the talk around has been intensified, and now there is a rethink about the possibility of its realization by 2030. So with that, I ask you all to give your full attention to Professor Karori Singh, and please all make sure that your camera is off during this presentation. And after this, we'll have the Q&A session for discussions and for your questions. So, Professor Singh, I'm giving you now the talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heba. Good afternoon, Dr. Heba, colleagues and friends. When Dr. Heba asked me to speak a special guest speaker webinar, I went through the profile of Jindal Global University and the center, Jindal Center for the Global South. What I discovered is normally the private sector higher education institutions are focusing on technical education like medical and health, engineering, management. They are paying less attention towards the liberal kind of studies and social sciences. But I found that here is the university in a developing country, which is focusing on the international affairs and social issues and like this. So I thought the Jindal group is again justifying its credibility and its standing in the Indian society by having social concern and working on the mission mode. So I was very much impressed by the profile of the university. About the center, the Jindal Center for Global South, I went through a profile of the team Heba and the center. Center is really having a global universalistic orientation. Its main focus is on the universal values like SDGs, human rights, and these universal issues which are having more humanitarian orientation. So I thought on which topic I should speak. Then, so one topic which is very close to my heart is the poverty. And I found the poverty is the first and foremost goal in the 17 SDGs. So I thought I must speak on SDGs. I must speak on poverty, which is the main goal under the SDGs to be achieved by 2030. And the recent COVID-19 pandemic has created so many problems, and the normal life has been disturbed. So our achievement of the SDGs is also at stake, and scholars have started projecting that it's almost impossible to realize these goals by the 2030. So I thought I must speak on the poverty, whether we will be able to have a poverty-free society or make the poverty free, or no one should be left behind, and like these slogans will be reality or not. So I thought I must speak on this topic. And then I discovered poverty is a serious problem in the global south, though the north is also affected by it. And my thinking about poverty stems from one incident about a decade back. I was speaking on poverty. And I was mentioning the characteristics of the poor, definition of poverty, like bookish kind of things. One person from the audience says, from the back benches, stood up and asked me a question. Sir, what poverty is, how oppressed poor people are, this much we are realizing in our everyday life. Tell us how to get rid of it. Then I thought there is something seriously and critically wrong with our poverty discourse. So still the poverty is prevalent as oldest human menace. Because when the human beings started the organized life, poverty is continuing since then. So what exactly is poverty, and how we have defined poverty, and whether our understanding of poverty is appropriate and not. So whatever my study and understanding during a couple of decades is that we have highly inadequate understanding, and therefore our policies and strategies are inappropriate. This is the gist of my presentation. So I would like to elaborate this gist of my presentation, about an hour presentation. So first, we must understand what exactly poverty is and how we have tried to understand poverty in the past. So generally, we define poverty in terms of economic deprivation, because in our higher education institutions, poverty is a subject to be studied in economics. When I asked to the political science people, they say we have nothing to do with the poverty studies. Ours is the political institutions, political processes, political thought, international relations. That is our concern. We are not concerned about the poverty. Similarly, in other disciplines also this is there. So predominantly poverty is being considered as a study content in economics only. So the economic deprivation is the main concern, and how we can prevent the economic deprivation, and this sort of condition can be prevented. About this, economists are undertaking studies. Then the second component of poverty is the lack of security of basic material needs. What we call the roti, kapda, makan in the South Asian context. And this has filtered down up to the illiterate people level. They know the roti, kapda, makan is more important. Even in the film industry, this film is there. So basic needs of the people, but for a scholar, this is the one basic need, that is the material. There are so many other basic needs we should also be taken into consideration while we are studying poverty. And the other needs are the psychological needs, and the intellectual needs, reproductive needs, and intellectual needs, spiritual needs. But this only basic needs is considered only material aspect of the disciplines and material aspect of the society. So it's a one-dimensional kind of thing. The third component is lack of entitlement over a long period of time. Some sections, some groups, some individuals, they had entitlement of the resources, not only material resources, but non-material resources like honor, prestige. These were entitled to certain individuals. So it has created a sort of problem. And the poor people are not having any entitlement of the material or non-material resources. This is well taken. Then the lack of opportunities. The opportunities are very limited, and there are so many institutional, cultural, and systemic constraints. Because of that, there is a lack of opportunities for the people, and those who are lacking the opportunities, they are considered poor. Then the powerlessness. It is basically a political thing, and they are the powerless. They cannot pressurize and influence other groups and other human beings to get their things done. And another component is social exclusion and denial of human rights. This is more important these days. We have been talking about. And then all the above are having psychological, emotional, mental, neurological, and physical health impact, which in turn sustains the unacceptable level of poverty. So in poverty studies, when we try to define, we have considered so many components, and what is the consequence of these components that we have not considered in the poverty studies, and we did not try to measure it, define it. So it's basically in the material sense of the term. So when we talk of poverty, sometimes I think in the benevolent kings used to provide some relief and material help to his subjects. So he was also having some kind of poverty eradication. So what is the specific about the present democratic kind of system, that what poverty eradication is different from that? Even the colonial rulers, they were also having certain facilities, certain relief measures for the poor people, for the people in their colonies. So they were also, in a way, pursuing some kind of poverty eradication measures. So even in present day, what we consider poverty eradication is, it is primarily one thing, that is to provide some relief to the poor people. It's some kind of humanitarian assistance. It's not the poverty eradication in real sense of the term. Of course, the relief and the humanitarian assistance is important step towards the poverty eradication. But humanitarian assistance and relief is not the poverty eradication. So we have a very limited understanding, and therefore poverty is basically considered, sometimes there is a large group of people might be thinking that it is the natural order of things. Our prosperity is not responsible of someone's poverty, and these type of logics are coming up in our society. Similarly, there is the theological and the religious kind of school. They are saying it's the result of past karma, the earlier deeds, result of earlier deeds, or something like this. But here, when we are talking here, it means it is neither a divine kind of curse nor a natural order of things. It is something which stems from human activities and attitudes. When I say the human activities, it means institutions and policies evolved over a long period of time, and attitude, that is the culture. So the poverty is the result of institutions, policies, and cultures which we have pursued over a long period of time. And therefore, it is inherently human rights issue. And these days, at the global level, scholarly community is talking about poverty as a human rights issue, and this discourse is being advanced by the UNESCO. So, in turn, the poverty makes the people disabled to exercise their human rights, because poor people cannot exercise their human rights, and they are not having human rights, so they are the poor. So this sort of a vicious circle is there, and this circle must be broken. And so this is the first slide about defining the poverty, and there is some ambiguity in that as well. So how we have tried to measure and define the poverty, on what basis? Generally in the South Asian context, we define poverty in the calorie based. For instance, those who are getting 2,400 calories in rural areas and 2,100 calories in urban areas are not being considered poor. They are above the poverty line or something like this. Income-based, different criteria. All the countries have different national poverty line, and those who are below these poverty, this income level, they are being considered poor, and we call them BPL, below poverty line people. Then consumption level, because there is also the measurement of poverty on the level of consumption, poverty of opportunities, and has not been much used in our part of the world. And then the multidimensional poverty index, and that has been advanced by the Oxford School. Because poverty is not the unidimensional, there are so many dimensions, and that multidimensional approach has 3 dimensions and 10 indicators through which we can define the poverty. Then in every society there are some ideological forces, because forces compel the system to take certain policy and strategies to provide relief and to the poor people, and that can lead to the poverty eradication. And these measures, again, generating a certain kind of forces. So again, there's the causal relationship between forces which are compelling for certain measures, certain steps for poverty eradication, and certain measures and steps are also generating certain kind of forces. So in the South Asian context, we had so many forces. Some of them are marginalized, ideologically motivated, and some are in the mainstream. So I try to explain these ideological moorings in the South Asian context as the liberal constitutional, how they viewed the poverty, what had been the strategy and program, what were the objectives, and what were the weakness of a particular ideological consideration. And then the radical socialist and technocratic. Then the Gandhian, in the South Asian context, Gandhian framework remain very important, and still there are a large number of Gandhians, they are talking about the Gandhian way of poverty eradication, then the human rights framework. So all these frameworks I try to explain on the basis of their review of poverty situation, strategy, program, objectives, and weaknesses. So no framework is perfect about the poverty eradication. I cannot dwell into details, but in the question answer, I may speak on these theoretical and ideological perspectives of poverty situation. In the poverty profile of South Asia, because generally we talk of poverty, then we give some statistics, because quantification is more important these days. And so quite often I call it a sort of quantification fundamentalism because of the algorithm, and the dissimulative aspect is being practically ignored in our research works. We talk in the algorithm way, or we say ours is the scientific study. I think it is not the perfect one. So that is the different, somewhere else I spoke about the epistemological convergence, the Western epistemology and the South Asian epistemology. That is the different story. But the main aspect in the social science and about understanding of poverty is the statistics. And about the statistics, there are different type of statistics on the different bases how you have measured the poverty. some scholars, some committees, and some governmental departments, they try to measure on the consumption basis. Others try to measure it on generate statistics through income basis, like World Bank and other international agencies. They lay emphasis on the income, and then the multidimensional, the Oxford School, in all these days we can say that 33.4% of the world's poor in South Asia. It means South Asia is harboring nearly 1/3 of the poor in at the global level. It is an increase over time from 27.3% in 1990. So it is increasing, and the world this has been measured on the basis of $1.90 per day income. Then the 48% of the world's poor from 51% in 2010. This is a multidimensional poverty index basis. On the basis of that, it has been explained that there are 48% people are poor, and it is a decrease from the 51% to 48%. And there are 46 million people. This is more important about the modern victim of modern slavery in the world. And out of the 46 million, nearly half of these modern slave victim of modern slavery are in South Asia only, and in India only 18.3 million are victim of the modern slavery. They are the worse than the poverty-stricken people. This is the sorry state of affairs. It has been discovered by the Australia-based the Walk Free Foundation. Largest number of South Asian poor are in India, and they have spatial and caste differences because the poor are very sparsely distributed in different parts of the South Asian countries. It's not the uniform on the basis of caste, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of different groups, different states. In all the South Asian countries, it's not the uniform. Some states, some provinces are poverty-stricken, others are better off, something like this. So it's not a uniform matter. When we want to understand the poverty situation and the poverty profile in South Asia, we shall have to go for disaggregated. The national aggregates and the regional aggregates will be misleading. So we must go for details in a disaggregated manner, but that's not the time here to speak about that, the disaggregated statistics. 80% of India's poor are in rural areas, out of which 51% are casual laborers, and big cities have 6%, most of them are casual laborers. 43% SC, ST, and 12% upper caste people are poor in India. It means the caste is also a consideration. The lower caste people, the largest number of poor people are in the lower caste because of the social exclusion. And so social exclusion is also related with the poverty and income as well. Apart from their psychological and the mental impact, the material impact is there on the low caste people. And then 62% of poor are in 7 states, which have 45% of the population in India. After having this profile, the COVID then, because this is the situation before the COVID, at the eve of the COVID outbreak. But when the COVID outbreak, this is really unexpected pandemic emergency. Nobody could anticipate it. It's unanticipated. It has adversely affected the income, jobs, and livelihood of the people. And the poor are the worst sufferer. The multilateral and UN agencies warned that such effects will continue for a long. Thus, the number of poor will further increase. So the COVID effect will be that number of poor will continue to increase. It will not decrease because of the various reasons, and the COVID emergency will continue for a long time. So when we see this situation, poverty is becoming a worse kind of condition in the South Asian context. Though in the long history, large number of committees and have been appointed, like right from the independence and when the colonial rulers left them, and all these committees in different periods of time defined poverty and generated statistics on different bases. So I have a long list of committees: Minhas, Dandekar, OJA, Task Force, Burdan, YK Alag, Lakrawala. These are the committees in India. Then the NC Saxena, then Suresh Dandekar and the Rangarajan. Large number of committees, and they try to define the poverty and explain and they generate the statistics. And on the basis of these statistics, we say that they have defined poverty that someone is getting 33 rupees or 42 rupees or 28 rupees or 27 rupees per day is not poor. So it is about the severity of poverty they have defined, but that is not exactly poverty. That is the inhuman condition. That is the relief measures they need. So that is not the poverty, but in our literature, in our studies, we consider it as a poverty. But they are living in inhuman condition, and that is why we call them below poverty line. Otherwise, nobody can survive on the basis of 42 rupees per day or the 32 rupees per day and like that. So, but large number of committees try to explain this in a different way. So I do have a long list and statistics as well. If there will be some question, I will explain it further. The nature of policies in different phases. In the post-colonial South Asia, the first attempt was to correct the colonial policies and bureaucratic practice. Under that, the community development program, then the land to the tiller, which was the slogan of the national freedom struggle, and a certain kind of land reforms like in Sri Lanka, India, and even the Muslim League also having some agenda of the land reforms. And so that was the first phase of the policies in the post-colonial South Asia. So, and thereafter, because of the food shortage, the agricultural modernization efforts were also initiated. That was the policy. Because just providing relief is not the poverty eradication. There must be supporting policies and strategies. Then it can be the poverty eradication. So how these policies and strategies supported and helped in poverty eradication? If you are providing some help food to a hungry person, it is not the poverty eradication in the real sense of the term. It's the humanitarian assistance. So there must be supporting policy, and how our development model has been a sort of pro-poor or the poverty help in poverty eradication. So the next stage phase was the nationalization and redistributive measures during 70s. There were certain limitations, the import substitution policies and the decline of production, and so many things took place, because without generating wealth, what you can distribute, and these were the arguments during that period. So but that was the policy emphasis during 70s, and towards accelerated economic growth during 80s and 90s, and then attempt had been made to harmonize harmonize all these above measures, and emphasis was laid on infrastructure and human development. If you are having human development and infrastructure, and then poverty may be reduced to some extent. And thereafter, during this century, a shift has been observed on the rights-based approach, not the anti-poverty, but rights-based approach. And during UPA regime, the rights-based approach was more important, and particularly the National Advisory Council advised the government. Of course, a National Advisory Council faced so many criticism because of being extra constitutional body, but one positive contribution of the National Advisory Council is to emphasize the rights-based approach. And this council recommended so many acts for enabling the people to exercise their rights like right to employment, right to food, right to information, right to education, right to health, Forest Rights Act. So this rights-based approach has been emphasized, but this approach has been reversed after 2014 when NDA government came to power. They laid emphasis on anti-poverty strategy instead of the rights-based approach. Of course, both are talking about the poverty eradication and poverty reduction, but the emphasis and the approaches are different. So there had been different policy emphasis in different phases of history during the, what should I say, about 73 years of post-colonial South Asia. Then the regrouping these programs, whatever the policy emphasis had been, and the programs have been implemented, we can regroup them, relief and humanitarian assistance. This we call poverty eradication programs, only the relief and humanitarian assistance. Others are the supportive, the ameliorative programs, redistributive programs, educative programs, and the institution building programs like Panchayati Raj and the cooperatives and these institution building, the expanding education and making education more inclusive. And these were the measures, and all these, whatever the programs have been introduced so far in the South Asian countries may be regrouped into these five categories. And the poverty eradication, direct poverty eradication is only the one group, that is the relief and humanitarian assistance. That is important. I am again emphasizing that is important. The relief and humanitarian assistance is important, but that's not the poverty eradication. Unless or until there are pro-poor ameliorative programs, redistributive programs, educative programs, and institution building programs, then there can be poverty eradication. Otherwise, there cannot be poverty eradication. Then poverty discourse, historical perspective, what sort of poverty discourse we had in the South Asian context, right from the national freedom struggle. Even during the national freedom struggle, most of you might be aware about the one book, Dadabhai Naoroji, the leader of national freedom struggle, who contested election for British Parliament in Britain, and he was the first Indian to enter in the British House of Commons. So that a scholar wrote a book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. So his emphasis was that India, there is poverty, and poverty is because of the un-British rule. Give us the British rule. It means British traditions, the democratic spirit of the Britain, and all these things they demanded. And that practically means the Britishers will go away from here. The India will not be the victim of colonialism. That was the different way of conveying the message that the reason of poverty is un-British rule. Here the rule is oppressive. Otherwise, British rule can't be oppressive. It should be according to the British traditions and like that. So that from there onwards, we have large number of publications, books, and the discourse within the university and outside the university setup, and even at the civil society level. We have different phases of the poverty discourse. So this discourse, I have tried to explain it, how the what explanation they gave of the poverty situation, methods applied and nature of the studies, connection with human rights, aims and objectives, main findings and shortcomings, what had been the shortcomings of a poverty discourse at a particular point of time in a particular phase. So this table I have prepared. So due to shortage of time, I won't go into the details and dwell on details. So you can view it. The first phase was the colonial period, then the post-colonial period, it was 50s up to and 70s. Then the second phase was 80s and 90s, and the third phase in the beginning of 21st century. So in all these phases, poverty discourse has been advanced by civil society organizations, politico-bureaucratic elite and the academic community. Their study, their understanding, their explanation are different, but they all have combinedly and collectively advanced the poverty discourse in the South Asian context, and whatever the poverty discourse they have advanced is, it has moved from one step to the another step. It's a sort of advancement, and they ultimately try to connect it with the human rights. So this discourse had a long journey to discuss about the poverty. Of course, there are limitations. I will come on that aspect a little later. Then the different sets of poverty studies. So the poverty studies as a major component of larger freedom struggle against the colonialism and imperialism, often intended to attain reformative and mobilizational objective. So during the colonial period, the basic objective was to mobilize the people, to reform the system, and to mobilize people against the colonial imperial rule. That was the consideration, and that is why the scholar leaders during the freedom struggle, they talk of poverty in India, and the remedy was the end of the colonial rule. But at the same time, they also recognize that the poverty is not merely because of the colonial rule. There are inherent elements in the South Asian society, within the society, and these should also be corrected, but they will be corrected once the colonial rulers leave this subcontinent. So that was the set of studies during the colonial period, and thereafter, in the very well-structured manner in different institutional setups, and that set is defining poverty in its multidimensional facets. This is the one group of studies that try to define poverty in taking several dimensions into considerations, and then the measurement of the extent of poverty, how to measure the poverty. They also attempted to measure the poverty, estimation of the number of poor in particular group, area, and their characteristics, and the policy analysis and program evaluation. So the most of the studies, they are in the policy analysis and program evaluation categories, if we talk of the in the disciplinary context. But one thing I have realized is, whatever these sets of poverty studies are there, in the South Asian context, we have three types of the intellectual institutional setups: university setups, within the university, area studies, and the social science and development studies institutes outside the university setup. And the poverty studies are primarily undertaken by the development studies institutes and the social science institutes outside the university setup. Within the university setup, generally the economics department undertook some studies, and area studies focused more on the international relations, foreign policies, and the domestic politics, domestic economy, and society of different areas where India has some interest. So area studies did not focus much on poverty. The conventional disciplines in the university setup, they did not focus much on the poverty issue. Only the institutes outside the university setup, they focus more on the poverty studies, and all these studies we can group on the basis of their emphasis. So these are the different sets or groups of studies. Then the determinants of poverty discourse. So the first determinant is the policies and programs undertaken by governments. Unfortunately or fortunately, here, how the poverty discourse has been advanced, that is, I should say, wrongly advanced, is first the governments and politico-administrative elites have introduced certain kind of programs and policies, maybe inspired by the international agencies, World Bank or whatever it is. But once they have initiated certain kind of programs and policies, then the intellectuals and social scientists and the scholars started undertaking their review and their studies on that. So the studies did not inspire the policies and programs. The the poverty discourse did not inspire the policies and program. Rather, policies and programs inspired the discourse. This is the first determinant. And the second one is the development and evolution process of the social science disciplines. How social science disciplines evolved in the university setup, that also been an important aspect because every social science discipline has its own methods, own epistemology, even on terminology. So the social science disciplines have been advanced in the general sense how they evolved, and they started from the exclusive and the exclusive disciplines to the interdisciplinary and then the multidisciplinary and like that. So the changing nature of the evolutionary process of social science disciplines has also determined the poverty discourse and the disciplinary background of the scholar and researcher. Suppose I'm from political science and someone else from economics and another one is from anthropology, their focus and approach will be different. So the disciplinary background also remain important and determine the poverty discourse. And then the socio-economic background of the scholars prompted them to construct the poverty situation conform to their group interest and guided by maintaining status quo or stability. This is rather more important because here in our part of the world, if somebody is coming from a particular group, say a particular socio-economic background, he will undertake study on that aspect. Suppose the feminism and how women are suffering, and so mostly the women are undertaking the research on that. So the people are coming from a particular background, socio-economic background, they undertook a study according to their group interest. So this is the unfortunate thing, but this is the determinant of the poverty discourse. And sometimes it led to the bias in their studies as well. Then COVID-19 crisis and the way ahead. What can be the way ahead? The COVID-19 will reproduce poverty at large scale due to severe economic crisis. There are studies that the COVID effect will be more serious on economy, society, and even on politics. The new kind of political dispensation may emerge. So it will reproduce poverty because the COVID is affecting the people's job, income, and the living conditions, and everything it is affecting. So it will most likely it will reproduce poverty. And there are so many writings, journalistic writings, and some surveys are available that poverty is continuously increasing in all parts of the world, not only in South Asia. So the COVID-19 effect will be the reproduction of the poverty. Though there is no systematic study, it may take some time. I think within a few months or maybe within a year, there will be some systematic scientific study, what type of impact it has and how far it has reproduced the poverty in the South Asian context or in any other part of the world. But certainly, because if we are having something obvious and presenting it in a statistical manner, that is the research, that is important. Statistics is important. But if something is well obvious, it's well understood that COVID is having an effect on the poverty generation and it will generate poverty in future. Then the rising forces of neo-con nationalism versus vis-a-vis neoliberal globalism will further marginalize the left forces and weaken the global governance system. This is the serious development taking place. Of course, the trend was visible at the eve of the COVID-19 breakout. But after the COVID, this is becoming very important trend, and it will affect every walk of life. Even the UN General Secretary, while speaking at International Human Rights Council, that the state is becoming very strong and the neocon forces are trying to reinvent the nationalism. It will have serious impact on every society. So the neoliberal national globalism and neo-con-nationalism will simultaneously will be visible in every society, and left forces and and therefore the global governance system will be weakened, because the global governance system has universalized certain values like SDGs, human rights, democracy, disarmament, and this global governance system is being weakened due to the neo-con assertion of the neo-con nationalism. And what type of effect it will have on the poverty eradication or poverty generation, it is yet to be seen. But this trend has been intensified after the COVID outbreak. Of course, the trend was visible, but it has been intensified. The third one is the scripture-inspired culture and tradition may take precedence over constitution-driven law and policy in order to restore status quo ante. This is also becoming a serious challenge in the old societies. Of course, the constitution, policy, and laws were there, but these scripture-driven tradition and culture are reasserting. So whatever the poverty eradication has taken place, and that is why we are talking about the modern slavery. So things are a sort of reversion is there. So the rich and poor, how this will increase the gap in the rich and poor, and what will be the impact of it. But this trend is also visible. Then the rights-based approach will be relegated into the background. This is already visible. Now no government, anywhere in on this planet is talking about the rights-based approach. It has been practically relegated into the background, and that is why so many movements and so many upsurges are taking place. The rights-based approach is not gaining importance, and the poverty as socio-economic conditions continue to worsen due to lack of income, employment, and livelihood means. So the poverty will increase, the condition of the poor people will worsen further unless or until some meaningful measures are undertaken and some wealth is generated. But how the governments will do it, that is the challenge before the governments as well. So the COVID, the next one is thus the political conflict, economic crisis, and social turmoil will continue to have adverse impact on poverty eradication in South Asia. Because of these conditions, there will be political conflict, not the ideological conflict, but political conflict. The economic crisis will continue and there will be social turmoil. So because of these, there will be some adverse impact on the poverty and eradication. And one thing has become very, very clear, which is most unfortunate, we will see that the COVID effect, the COVID effect has exposed our system, exposed our civil society, exposed our law and policy, how they are fragile. This has been exposed by the COVID crisis when the labor mobilization, the labor migration took place, how the labor has suffered. Otherwise, you see, the civil society organizations are helping, but in this case, neither system could help much, nor the laws and policies, nor the civil society organizations. If there would have been some devotional activities and some religious procession or some padayatra and like this, even the civil society organizations could have come forward, and every corner at every kilometer there would have been some tent and providing all the relief measures, food and every shelter, everything they used to provide. But in this case, how insensitive our society is becoming is most unfortunate. But every one of you might have observed it, that how insensitive, and we are lacking the sense of empathy towards the poor, how the labor has suffered. If we would have been so sensitive and having empathy, I think the labor would not have suffered like this. but this trend is visible, and it will certainly intensify the already emerging political conflict, economic crisis, and turmoil in the society. And whether there will be some movement, because the most important thing is there are certain organizations which are having some kind of movement global level, like the ATD, Fourth World Movement, All Together for Dignity. This is the global movement having special status in the UN General Assembly. So that, these movements are not picking up in the South Asian context. So, but there will be some campaign for poverty eradication. And there will not be some movement, but campaign will be there. And this campaign will be the political necessity of the political elite in a democratic system. So the political leaders will talk of the poverty eradication rhetoric, but at the operational level, they will be sabotaged, or they will not pursue the poverty eradication policy and strategy seriously. But in the it will be as a campaign that our leadership and the system is going to eradicate the poverty, but it will not be effective enough. Then the conclusion, what can we conclude out of it? Inadequate conceptual and theoretical understanding. We try to understand poverty just in terms of the relief measures, humanitarian assistance, and we consider that is the poverty, and if we are providing that, it means we are going towards the poverty eradication. Then we have, in order to become more scientific, we have devised certain kind of components of the poverty. And what has been the consequence of these components, we did not try to take into account in our poverty calculation, and to define the poverty like the neurological, psychological, mental, and like this. Suppose somebody is on fast, he is not taking food, and somebody is poor, so he is not getting food. The mental condition of both will be the same, but materially we will say both the persons did not take food. So that condition, psychological condition, of course it's the subjective, but the technology is so advanced, these subjective conditions can be measured over a period of time. So that should be taken into consideration. So our conceptual and theoretical understanding is inadequate. It must be expanded through the technological support, and something which we consider unquantifiable, not quantifiable, should also be quantified on the basis of certain variables. The second conclusion is South Asian region has largest number of poor. After the sub-Saharan, largest number of poor, but in terms of the percentage, it's the second, because sub-Saharan is the first area. But since the population is more than the sub-Saharan region, so the largest number of poor are in the South Asian region. Then the national and regional aggregates are misleading. That I have already explained, that quite often we talk about the micro level, the Indian poverty in India, poverty in Sri Lanka, poverty in Bangladesh. But when we go into the depth, and then in the disaggregated manner, it will be having a different kind of picture of the poverty map. So it's a misleading, because in certain groups, there are prosperous groups within the poor society, and there are poverty-stricken people, like in the cities, there is splendor on the one side and the slums on the other side. So these kind of poverty situations, so we must go for disaggregated understanding of the, instead of the micro level or aggregated national aggregates or regional South Asia level aggregates. Poverty among some socio-cultural and spatial groups is severe than in other groups. Like the lower caste people, the poverty is more severe than the upper caste people. Because in the upper caste people, there is a 12% upper caste people are poor, whereas in the lower caste it is nearly more than 40% of people are poor. Similarly, the tribal and ethnic dimension is there. So in some cultural groups, some caste groups, poverty is more severe than other groups, and that should be addressed, that should be taken into account while talking about the poverty understanding and poverty eradication. Then the poverty eradication remains a component of overall development process. The poverty eradication is not exclusive. What is exclusive is to the relief and humanitarian measures. I have repeatedly told it. That it's not exclusive. It is the one component of the overall developmental process. And the poor people, if they are their poverty is eradicated, they can contribute a lot to the development and economic growth. They have that potentials. Once their poverty is eradicated and their confidence is restored, then they can have immense potentials to contribute to the overall development process in every society, not only in the South Asia, in other parts of the world as well. Poor people failed to form an identity to launch a movement like other identities in a democratic. Then in a democratic society, the identity politics is more important. Certain caste groups, they have particular pressure group, they are operating like a pressure group. But poor people, of course, maybe the less in terms of percentages, but these other identities cut across the poor people. Because the poor, even in the gender, there might be the women from the rich background, women from the poor background. Both cannot have a similar interest. Their interest will be different. Similarly, there may be one person from the upper caste background, may be poor, and there may be some lower caste person from lower caste background, but having richer background. So the poor people fail to form an identity. And in the democratic politics, I think identity politics is more important. And with the identity politics, you can pressurize the system, you can compel the system to undertake specific measures for eradication of the poverty, but that is not happening. And sometimes I read somewhere some chairperson of International Social Science Council wrote one article, can poor people finance the research on poverty? So unless or until poor people have their own researchers, their poverty cannot be eradicated. That was the conclusion of that article. But poor people, how the poor people can have their own researchers to eradicate the poverty? So that is the serious challenge. So we can expect only one thing, then that the scholars and persons, those who are highly sensitized and having empathy towards poor, they can be helpful in poverty eradication and giving a particular direction to poverty discourse for its eradication. Then the suggestions, what can be the suggestions? Because since our Jindal Center for the Global South is member of Sustainable Development Support Solution, Sustainable Development Solution Network, and there we should talk of the solution. If we are having debunking attitude, I'm criticizing each and everything, I'm saying this is not poverty, this is not poverty eradication, this thing went wrong, that thing went wrong, that is not going to help. What can be some constructive suggestion? What can be the solution then? Then poverty eradication must focus not only on causes of poverty, but also on consequences of poverty, which play a major role in reproduction of poverty in some form or the other. So the poverty studies and the poverty eradication must focus on the consequences. What type of consequences the poor people are facing, how their state of mind, their state of intellect, their state of emotions is disturbing, and how they are having traumatic situation, how they are losing their dignity. These should be in consideration. And otherwise, suppose you have, through the several measures of the humanitarian assistance, you have helped the poor. but that person will fall back into the poverty trap again, and the poverty will be reproduced unless or until we generate some confidence, some give some dignity kind of things. So poverty eradication must focus on consequences as well, not merely causes. Then the second point is the participation and involvement of the poor must be important component of poverty eradication process. It should not be merely an interventionist program. There is a poverty-stricken group, somebody in the outside the system is interfering, helping them, or giving some training or something like this. But there must be mobilization from within the group, and how it can be generated there. I think the education can be the most appropriate instrument to generate that sort of instrument. But how is education? I will come at a little later stage. So, but education can be the most important means to make them aware, make them conscious, and then they can actively participate, proactively participate in the poverty eradication programs and help themselves as well. Not in helping them through outside intervention, but they themselves can help themselves. So the next suggestion, poverty must be redefined, not merely a sum of its components like lack of security of basic material needs, lack of entitlement, both material and non-material resources, economic deprivation, powerlessness, social exclusion, lack of opportunities, as has been done in the past. But the sum of it greater than aggregate of its components. Because in the beginning, in the first slide, I have mentioned that these are the components of the poverty. But poverty is not merely aggregate of this. When we make the aggregate of this, the sum becomes qualitatively different. For instance, we are preparing tea. We are having milk, tea, water, sugar, like these 3-4 components. And then we are preparing it and it just called tea, not the milk or sugar or water. We don't call it. Similarly, when we talk of poverty, it's not the merely collection and aggregation of the components of poverty, but when we combine together all these components, a qualitatively different thing emerges, and that is the degraded human being. Degraded being. That person has lost his dignity as a traumatic kind of human being. So that must be understood. And you may ask the question, how these humanitarian questions and in the subjective things can be measured, can be quantified. I think over a period of time, it can be possible. When the UNDP devised the social development indicators, nobody was expecting that there will be some indicators of the social development, but they came and now they are the well accepted. So some kind of process should be initiated, and we should not have excuse that these are the humanitarian issues and the human rights and these things cannot be measured. There are no indicators, but it can be done. So we must advance the poverty discourse and define the poverty, not merely aggregate of its components, but the sum of these components is greater than the aggregation of these components, and that should happen, and that should be done at the intellectual level, at the scholarly community level. Then the next suggestion, there is growing challenge to evolve scientific indicators of larger cognitive and humanitarian issues coming into focus in the poverty condition. So in the earlier point, I told that these some of the humanitarian issues that they cannot be measured. It's a challenge. Of course, there can right at the moment we don't have any scientific indicators, but indicators have been developed. Even the SDGs have developed the indicators and targets and a large number of targets, large number of indicators. So there can be some kind of indicators of these humanitarian issues like human rights and the traumatic situation, and then what are the consequences of poverty, and these can be done. It's a challenge, but scholarly community must take on this challenge. Then the poverty studies must be broad-based by recognizing it as an important component of higher education for greater insight and understanding. This is most important suggestion for me, as I think, because I have seen the course contents of so many disciplines. They don't have poverty issue as in their contents. And they, suppose I say the political science people, they are saying, oh, no, we are not concerned about the poverty. It's not an issue in the political science. Why it is not issue? We shall have to broad base it. Since the poverty is the greatest menace of human society, greatest and oldest menace of human society, we shall have to be sensitive, we shall have to be sensitized, we shall have to be empathy towards the poor. So why we are not broad basing our disciplines by incorporating in their course contents the poverty studies? We are having so many studies, but why not the poverty studies? We are having studies of the individuals. Individual can't be greater than the society, but we are studying the individuals in our course contents, but not the poverty. So that it should be broad-based. And when once we broad-based, we will have a large number of people, a community of scholars who are sensitized, who are having understanding of the poverty and who are having empathy towards the poor. And over a period of time, they will undertake research on the poverty-related issues, and it will be the multiplicative effect on transforming the poverty discourse. And there is no financial implication at all. Just to recognize and accept the poverty as a poverty studies as a content in our course contents at the master's level, at the graduation level. So poverty studies must be broad-based, and it can help. And it is in the interest of the society. It should be done. So, but who will be listening my voice? I don't know. And then the next point. It will sensitize intellectual. What will be the impact once we broad-base the poverty studies by incorporating the poverty studies into our course content? What will be the impact? So it will sensitize intellectuals and corporate community towards poverty. Such a sensitization will have an impact on policy for poverty eradication. It is already visible in the form of impact investing, social entrepreneurship, and the business fights poverty. These are the trends already available. So these trends will be strengthened further. So once we have broad-based the poverty studies, we have incorporated poverty studies in our course contents, then definitely we will have a large number of intellectuals sensitized towards the poverty related, and they will have some innovative models of the poverty eradication, as models have already visible the impact investing, social entrepreneurship, particularly in case of Bangladesh. Muhammad Yunus and Heba has already undertaken some research on microfinance. One of my students, now he is a professor of economics at the Runa University, Sri Lanka. He undertook a study of microfinance in the southern province of Sri Lanka. He undertook the comparative study. And he assessed what had been the impact of the microfinance on poverty, on employment, and the confidence building of the assertiveness of the poor people, and like that he has assessed on the basis of various variables. So it can be done. So the new models of poverty eradication may come up, and then it can have a positive effect on containing the social turmoil, political crisis, political conflict, and the economic crisis. So it should happen, and it's already visible. But here, these issues will have to be taken up at the policy planning level of the higher education, and the new policy is. New education policy is in offering in this year only. Of course, it is under preparation for last 4 or 5 years. And I don't think the new education policy will have such kind of things. They might be having different agenda to have the education policy. But my personal feeling is that the new education policy must incorporate these socially and economically pressing issues, and they must advise certain kind of these issues instead of some kind of stereotype of the courses and the stereotype of these structures and the systems. So then what will happen? In turn, it will help in sustaining prosperity generated by technological advancement and scientific management. Because production and reproduction of poverty will result in vengeance and conflict, and thereby the prosperity will be at stake. Nowadays, we are having the gated colonies. It is the concept nowadays in the settlement pattern, the gated colonies. So the little bit of middle class and the upper class people, they are trying to fortify their living places and fortify that the poor people cannot encroach and poor people cannot disturb them. But how these gated colonies and the gated houses will be safe if we are having large scale poverty? So, and how this technological advancement, what we are talking about, the cyberspace and the different kind of technologies, how it will be safe unless or until we address the poverty? Because the large scale and then the intensified poverty will create a different type of tensions and conflicts in the society, and then hold the prosperity which we have achieved during last 300 years through the technological advancements after Renaissance, it will be at stake. And not only that, the European scholars have started realizing that we have achieved certain values like the freedom, socio-economic justice, and the nation-state system, and these values are at stake these days. The way the political developments are taking place, the way the neocon nationalism is coming up, so they are also worried about that whatever the achievements we have during last 300 years, they are at stake. And if we have a large-scale poverty, there is no socio-economic justice, and it's invisible. Because what the political leadership and system is doing, system in the democratic process, they are giving hope to the poor people and protection to the rich people. This is the role of the system. And hope to the poor people, and when their hope will be turn out as a despair, and what will be the result of that kind of the system, how the democracy will survive. So democracy itself will be understand, and democracy itself will be understand, then our prosperity will be at stake, and at that point of time, the conflict will be more severe. So it is imperative that we must take adequate measures for the poverty eradication, and there are ways, as I have suggested, at least we can broad-base the poverty studies. And if I see, for instance, I would like to give one example. I had been member of Board of Studies of Gandhian Studies Center. I try to emphasize them and to keep the village reconstruction model of Gandhi in the course content. Most of the scholars protested. They were resistant. They wanted to have the satyagraha, then Gandhi's strategies, the movements, and everything they wanted to have. But village reconstruction and the village community, they were resistant so much. So if we are having this type of resistance, we are not open as intellectual, we should be open enough to accept whatever the innovative, whatever is acceptable, whatever in the interest, but that is not happening. So I'm sure Team Heba will take a lead to emphasize, to impress upon the policy planners and the international agencies and even the Sustainable Development Solution Network that poverty studies must be an important component of higher education. There is no financial implication, no other implication, just to keep it in the course content. and it can be done easily. And once we will be able to do it, the poverty eradication goal, the first and foremost goal of the SDGs will be realized. Otherwise, 2030, I don't think any of the SDG will be realized. Of course, there will be the extension of the time limit, the timeline will be extended, but there must be some efforts to make things positive, because the governments are resistant, the systems are resistant, but the global community is coming forward, and most of the elite and the systems, they are very enthusiastic to accept the universalized values, but they are very reluctant to implement them, and they are somewhat sabotaging them in their the operational level. So these are the serious challenges we have. And nowadays, the faith in the global governance is losing. The superpowers like United States, and they are having different impressions, like the US has some grievances against the UNESCO, grievances against the WHO, against the WTO, and against the International Criminal Court, and something like this. So if superpowers are doing like this, where we are taking the world? So, and during the school days, all of us have been taught that human brain has immense potentials, infinite potentials. It can go up to the sky, it can go to the space, it can create the cyberspace, but it has not yet learned to live, how to live peacefully on this planet. And that is why we have not learned, is we are guided by our vested interest and the conflict of interest. And because of the vested interest and the conflict of interest, poverty eradication is still being a dream yet to be realized. But I think the way things are coming up, and even some sensitized the business houses and the industrial houses like the Jindal group, they are emphasizing these studies, they are promoting these studies. I think something positive will come up someday, because of course the well-informed optimist will turn out pessimist, but I am dogged optimist, and someday something positive and innovative will emerge, and there will be right step towards the poverty eradication. With these words, I would like to thank Team Heba and Jindal Global University for giving me this opportunity. I tried my best to provoke your thinking, to instigate you to grill me by your questions, by your bullets. So I think I should stop here right at the moment and wait for your questions, and I will try to respond to your questions to the best of my ability. That's all. Thank you very much, Team Heba and the Jindal Global University. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, so much. Please, yes. Would you please close this sharing the presentation? Yeah, I'm sorry. It looks in the voice, and I'm in my camera, so I'm for that. And anyone, please, is having his mic turned on, please make sure that your mic are off, please, as there is an echo in the sound, as I'm hearing. So thank you, Professor, so much first for your kind and encouraging words about the center, and when you were mentioning me and my, thank you so much. And thank you for same your enlightening and insightful presentation and deep analysis of the nature and roots of the poverty in general, and especially in South Asia. So as you were explaining, by having more or implementing more inclusive growth and human development, this is going to be the only way out of to end poverty in general, and especially in South Asia. So now, Professor Singh, we shall start the Q&A section of our session. And as I am seeing so far, we are having questions. Participants now, they are encouraged and they have written many questions. The first question is from our first question. Yeah, our first question is from Dr. Suman. The question is saying, is social hierarchy in India can be considered as a root cause of poverty? Another question is from Ashima Singh.
Heba,
Yeah.
what is the social stratification or social, what is the question exact? What is the
Do you think
exact?
Yeah, he is asking, is social hierarchy in India can be considered as a root cause of poverty?
Right.
Yeah, and Ashima is asking, what are the political barriers to implementing anti-poverty policies based on existing evidence and extensive evidence? So these there is other questions, but what do you think? I ask like two questions. What do you prefer, Professor?
I agree with Dr. Suman that the social hierarchy and social stratification is somewhat responsible for the poverty. But that is not exclusive, because the social hierarchy is not merely the material what we define the poverty. That is the more the social exclusion, and that is the worst kind of injustice, not merely poverty, but it's a sort of inhuman kind of treatment have been meted out to certain caste groups. And that is why Dr. Ambedkar was so vocal about this hierarchy, and it's rooted in culture. If I take it in a different way, Karl Marx taught us that basic structure and the super structure, the economic is the basic structure. What Ambedkar has told is, it's all right, the economic structure is the basic structure, but over a period of time, the culture and society becomes the base structure. A culture has been generated which is sustaining the poverty. So how to fight against the culture, that is the very serious thing, because it's not merely the economic thing. The way things are coming up, how the concentration of wealth and resources is taking place, even being a poor country, South Asian countries are being poor. But the concentration of wealth and property, the way it is taking place, that there are certain reports which are saying the 1% is owning 58% of the wealth of the South Asian countries. So if these things are there, who are these persons? So of course, the caste hierarchy is the worst than the poverty. Not only causes poverty, but it's worse than that. And that is why the reservation system was evolved. But reservation system is not sufficient to provide certain facilities in the economic and political realm. That is not sufficient. There must be a compensatory restructuring of the society should take place. Otherwise, the poverty in the lower caste people cannot be removed and eradicated. And the compensatory restructuring of the society will be never allowed given our political, economic, and social structures. So, Sumanji, I try to convince you this way. And then the political barriers in the anti-poverty program. There are two different types of programs: the rights-based approach and the pro-poor approach, and anti-poverty. Anti-poverty programs, we are not giving confidence to the poor. We are saying, I mean, the system is saying, the governing elite is saying, we are the givers, you are the receiver. They are not making them feel that it is your right to get it. So that is the anti-poverty. So national wealth may be generated, social wealth may be generated, but how this wealth is being distributed on the name of poverty eradication, just giver and taker. So the rights people must have a rights. The rights-based approach has been relegated into the background during this phase. So the anti-poverty program, you are not giving the confidence and that sort of dignity to the poor people. So that, of course, the political leaders shall have to talk about the rhetoric of the poverty eradication. They will quite often talk during the elections. They will talk too much, and they are saying we have eradicated this much poverty. That is the relief. That is the help. You help them. It's a humanitarian assistance. That's not the poverty eradication. So the anti-poverty, instead of the anti-poverty program, there must be rights-based approach and pro-poor system. Because you just not give some hope to the poor. You should do something for them to so their dream may be true. Their hope can be converted into the dream. But instead, the system, what system is doing, what the political leadership is doing, they are protecting the teachers and giving hope to the poor. And through this, a nexus kind of system has been developed, and they are mutually promoting. A sort of nexus is visible. Okay, that's all. Thank you. And what's the next question?
The next question is for Dr. Ved. Please, Ved Prakash. So I am asking you, please, to ask your question by yourself. So please make sure your mic is on and ask your question and turn off your camera. Yeah, so please, Dr. Ved Prakash. Yeah, so I think he's not getting us. Our next question is from Muhammad Abdullah. Muhammad Abdullah is saying, we know that the level of well-being of some groups exceeds the necessities of life. So how can the gap between those who can obtain opportunities in life and those who are deprived of it be reduced? So how to reduce the gap between who can have and who are not able to have? So I see that Dr. Ved is now ready to ask his question. So his voice is not clear. So I will ask another question, Professor Singh. Meanwhile, Kulsum is asking, instead of dividing the unprivileged on the basis of castes, can we as policymakers change the criteria to age-based or gender-based? In her view, shift will benefit the poorest of the poor. So she's asking, what is your views on this?
Very important question. So
yeah.
It is about the opportunity gap. Quite often, some of the civil society organizations, they are trying to mobilize the poor people. Sometimes for political action, sometimes for some sort of movement or representation kind of thing. And they are just mobilizing them. Unless or until we explain the opportunity, we develop their capacity, inculcate certain kind of capacity in them, the mobilization will not be so meaningful. So we shall have to explain before them that these are the opportunities, this is your capacity, and then we should mobilize. So sometimes we see that motivational speech. So we should not just motivate them, but we must go beyond them. We should develop their capacity. We should develop, explain the opportunities to them, and that is not happening. And the opportunities which are being restricted for the particular caste, particular groups, that is another aspect of, because once we are saying that you are having equal opportunity does not mean justice. Because if you are having equal before law, but once upon a time slavery was the legal. So every legal does not mean that is the with the sense of justice. So we are saying that we are having equal opportunity, equal before law, and these things, unless or until there is some pro-poor kind of policy, strategy, and the system. And system must be the pro-poor. And we are not going to that extent to have a pro-poor system to explain the opportunity, open up opportunity for the poor to look after themselves, that themselves can do, not to help them, but make them to help themselves. That should happen, and that is not happening till today. And another question about the diversity, that is making things very, very complex. Because the caste cut across a different groups, gender cut across different groups, and then the religion cut across different groups, and sometimes these primordial factors and these loyalties are becoming biggest mobilizer. And mobilizing people on the basis of these categories is harming the interest of the poor. And that is why I have mentioned that poor are not in a position to form an identity. And in a democratic system, the identity politics is more important. The identity, which is a strong group, vocal group, may get things done in its favor. Otherwise not. So in case of the poor people, there is a help from the outside. It's an interventionist kind of thing. So the poor people should be mobilized, but that is not happening. They don't have the identity. Identity politics is important, and poor are not in that position. And that is why I'm saying unless and until poor people have their own scholars, own leaders, I think it will be very difficult to eradicate the poverty. But we should be hopeful, we should be optimistic. Right, Eva, next question.
Next question is Muno is asking, he would like the role of international organization in eradicating poverty in South Asia. The role of international organization in eradicating poverty in South Asia. Another question is from Manisha. Manisha is asking, what is your view on the research researches that are trying to alter the parameters of poverty? What I don't know what she means exactly about this.
She might be asking, I think, about various variables and which we are using in the research in order to have scientific research. I think that aspect she might be asking. Various indicators and variables we are using in the research. I think that. So the question is about the international organization. International organizations cannot directly interfere in the national at the national level, because national governments are hypersensitive about their sovereignty. And that is why directly they cannot interfere. So what the international agencies, they can do through the national governments only, with the permission of the national government, they can advise the government, and governments may not be agree to accept all the advices of the international agencies. International agencies does not mean World Bank and IMF. International agencies means the global community, the United Nations. The United Nations, which has evolved the universal values like human rights, SDGs. World Bank has not developed the SDGs. So the World Bank and IMF, they are exclusively focusing on the economic component. But the global community, of course, is not the world government yet, and I don't think it will be world government in near future, but they are playing just advisory role. And no country is resisting the advice of the world global agencies and the United Nations or international agencies. They are not resisting, but they are not implementing. Sometimes no country is saying that I'm not against, I'm against human rights, but human rights are continuously being violated. So every country is saying we will accept the SDGs, we will achieve we are making efforts to achieve the SDGs, but still they are away from the SDGs because of the vested interest, because of the conflict interest. And the societies are structured in such a way that certain groups are deprived. And that generates a kind of nexus is there. And when the rights-based approach has been emphasized by the international agencies, it has determined all the established organizations like the religious organizations, the corporate houses, and the state. It determined all three because the individuals started having rights against all these three. So they have formed a kind of nexus against the people. So how poor people can rise under such a situation, that is the serious question. That our so-called, what should I say, the spiritual leaders and the political leaders, because with the Renaissance, the spiritual leaders and religious leaders were relegated into the background, the temporal, the state becomes important, but now they are asserting again. So it's not resolving the problem, because charity is not the poverty eradication. To helping the poor as a humanitarian, just to consider as a subject, is not the poverty eradication. And we should not emphasize these things. We must give right to the poor people. And the rights-based approach is not being accepted these days. And the international agencies like United Nations and some of the international agencies, they are still emphasizing this rights-based approach. So hope there will be some movement and there will be acceptance of the rights-based approach. And about the second question, about the indicators in defining and studying the poverty, I think we can expand and we should give the serious thought of it, because poverty studies is not merely a group of the social scientists or only a few social scientists can undertake the poverty research. I think we must have a group of, in this group for the poverty studies, there must be scholars from engineering background, from the medical science background, so that we can have a real gist of the poverty, what exactly poverty is. Poverty is not merely the material one. It is the psychological, it's the neurological, it is even emotional. So many components are there, and these components can be measured. It is possible. There are certain mechanisms through which we can measure these things. So we should have to redefine poverty in the broader sense of the term by taking into various scholars from various disciplines, various branches of knowledge. But the problem, however, is on the one hand, we are moving towards algorithm. We are talking everything to quantify. On the other hand, there is a dissimulative tactics prevailing in every society. So how can we sustain the balance? Of course, it seems the algorithm is taking precedence, but dissimulative tactics are not so weak right at the moment. So how can we have a sort of convergence of the both? That is the challenge. And when we will face this challenge, we will explain and understand this challenge. I think something positive will emerge. Yes, Eva.
Yes, Professor. So we do have more questions. First one, Habib Musavir is asking, which is the best measure for poverty measurement, like head count ratio, income gap ratio, or any other? So he's asking which is the best measurement for poverty from your point of view. Aisha is asking, what is in your opinion, how in your opinion can the poor acquire proper representation in academia and decision-making institutions? Muhammad Abdullah is asking, what is the effect of applying the universal based income system on social justice?
Yes, I am audible. Yes. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, these questions are very important. The best measurement is the right at the moment, whatever the available methods and techniques we have, the multidimensional poverty index, I think this is the latest one. Others are having only one-dimensional kind of things. So right at the moment, we can say that multidimensional poverty index that advanced by the Oxford School. So that can be the most appropriate measure because it has several indicators and several three dimensions and 10 indicators. So I think it's a relatively comprehensive, but it's not perfect yet. I don't believe it's a perfect. There must be some more factors should be taken into account, and someday I think some innovative and somebody will invent some new kind of method, because about a few years back, this was not the multidimensional poverty index was not there. Even social development indicators were not there. So gradually we are evolving, and something will. I'm not giving any revolutionary solution. That is why I referred the broad basing of the poverty studies through the course contents in the higher education. That is why I suggest a gradualist kind of approach, not any revolutionary change. Because in the revolutionary change, there are so many lapses, so many problems and loopholes. So I advise the gradualist, and I suggested the gradualist approach. And second, the poor in the decision making and how the poor can, that is the serious challenge. How you can make the poor to undertake the research, and that is practically impossible, because what we are doing on the name of poverty eradication, we are simply providing humanitarian assistance just to make them survive, just to sustain their existence. That is not the poverty eradication. Even the masters had interest in the survival of the slaves. They provided humanitarian assistance to the slaves. That's not the poverty eradication. So the real poverty eradication, when poor will be the decision-making position, poor will undertake their research, and what they have realized, that must be come forward. Just is not poverty studies and poverty understanding is not a mechanical exercise. We can sit in the armchair and we can calculate certain things through algorithm and through computers, and we can say this is the model of poverty eradication, through this we can do. And if we are doing like that, then there will be unanticipated consequences. We will anticipating certain kind of consequences as through the reservation system. We anticipated that through reservation we will have inclusive society, but it has promoted exclusion further. So unanticipated consequence has taken place. So we shall have to guard against the unanticipated consequences, and there must be certain kind of opportunities should be open for the poor people to reach at the decision-making position, at the academic level, at the level of innovation as well. And the last question about the minimum universal income that has been implemented in Canada, here in Sikkim in India. So that is one of the methods. It has been suggested the minimum universal income system must be applied. But I don't know the state is having that much resources and can do it, because our priorities are different. The state's priorities are different. And we shall have to learn from the European countries and what the European countries for the 2 world wars and what sort of destruction they have experienced, and thereafter they move towards the welfare orientation, particularly the Scandinavian countries. So minimum universal income system can be most of the one of the appropriate strategy, but I don't think it will be implemented at the all India level right at the point. Right, Eva?
So please, thanks, Professor. So Aru, please ask your question, and then Dr. Muhammad Kamali has a question also to ask. So start first, Aru. Okay. Yeah, I think that Aru is having a problem. Dr. Kal, are you ready to ask your question? You are raising your hand.
Okay, thank you very much. We are thankful to the professor for sparing your precious time, and also we are thankful to the Jindal Center for organizing such a wonderful event again. My question is relevant to the current pandemic, because in the current pandemic, the decision has to be made between the lives and livelihood. This is very important for every nation, particularly for the developing country and poor countries. So what should be the ideal policy for developing countries? I mean, what should be the ideal model for development and growth under this pandemic, particularly because this is a wake-up call for everybody. And second part of my question is how the rich countries can contribute to the reduced poverty among the poor countries in this pandemic. I mean, and after this pandemic. I mean, what kind of model you are suggesting, and what should be the prompt changes on the international level and the national levels? Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Aru, are you ready with your question? Yes, I'm asking you, Dr. Vet, I have asked you before to ask the question. So please unmute yourself and ask the question. We are not getting your voice.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Please let me complete my question. As discussed, the COVID-19 pandemic reduced poverty in India at large scale due to severe economic crisis. But my submission is that poverty could not finish completely in India due to start COVID-19 pandemic. There were more population living below poverty line in India. Many diseases the Indian government may be included in this. So the COVID pandemic increased the problem in the employment generation scheme, which may be helpful in reduction of the poverty in India.
Do you get his
question,
Professor?
Could I repeat, please? Could I repeat?
Yes. Should I respond?
Okay. No, my question is that the COVID-19 pandemic is not reproduce the poverty in India. It is increase in the problem of the population scheme. It increased the problem in the population scheme, not reproduce.
Okay, Dr. Beth. Yes, Doctor. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, so.
The first question had two parts. One is about the life in the pandemic and how it is going to affect the life and livelihood in the poor countries, of what is called the global south, and how the rich countries can help. Even before the pandemic, there was certain provisions that the rich countries will contribute certain amount of their GDP for to help the countries and the poor countries in the south. That was already there. Some of the developed countries, rich countries contributed, some have not contributed, some have contributed very less. So certain of that sort of thing is there. So the planning is there, but the life and livelihood will be different from the earlier life. And there will be so much stress and strains in the governing system that they shall have to think, refresh about the planning of the poverty eradication programs and how to deal with the situation. Yeah, normally we have a myth in the South Asian countries that population increase is the cause of poverty. That is the myth. That is not the cause of the poverty. There is a concentration of wealth within the South Asian countries. There is a discrimination, large-scale prevalent discrimination. These things are already there. So the life, but these will be getting worse during the pandemic. So how the problem will start, that will be different. With the pandemic, we are entering in the era of infodemic. And this will be creating the serious problem. From pandemic to infodemic, we will not be able to get what exactly is right information, correct information, accurate information. Because so much things are coming on the social media, which most of them are irrelevant, false, and fake. And how these things are forming the public opinion, that is the challenge. So with the pandemic, we should deal with the infodemic as well, and how to, the moment the state will put certain restrictions, it will be the assault on the individual liberty. So how to sustain the balance between the individual liberty and the state sovereignty? That is the challenge, and that is why the UN General Secretary warned that state is becoming all-powerful. That is the serious thing. It should not happen. So the people's rights must be recognized. And that is why I am emphasizing the rights-based approach. People must have rights against the state, rights against any of the oppressive system that should take place. So the rich countries are themselves suffering right at the moment. And it has been realized how fragile our systems are. We have realized this thing. And I think in future there may be some kind of, like we are having a cyber command or the space command, and now we are talking with the COVID warriors. So we will be having some kind of health command, in which that these health warriors will be their new kind of command, and this will be becoming a necessity, but it will not help beyond certain limit. How to deal with the poverty, that is the thing. At least people must have opportunity to realize their potentials, and that people are not getting. So this will be very serious, and rich countries will not be able to help beyond certain limit to a great extent. So that is why in India, our Prime Minister is talking Atmanirbhar. How we can be Atmanirbhar under such a situation? Resources are limited. And the political rhetoric, we can say we have large number of resources, we have ample resources, but in real terms, we have limited resources. We can be nostalgia of the past. But the current challenges are very serious. Resources are limited. We cannot remain dependent on other countries. So we shall have to optimize whatever we have. And while optimizing that, we must ensure that each and every person will get the opportunity to realize his or her full potentials. That should be ensured. So the rights of the people should be protected and enabled. Not only protected, but people must be enabled their rights. I think that's right at the moment. Yes, Eva.
Hello, can I ask? Can I ask one question more to Shah?
Yeah, go ahead. So I have ended the Q&A question, but go ahead, Mr. Nimi.
I'm asking a question to Professor Karori Singh. That in South Asia, we have seen during the COVID pandemic that people's migrating from cities to the rural area. And another thing is that in India, our real or original economic model is unorganized sector. But we have seen that the people's taking or thinking or hopping from the villages. The present model should be based on the Gandhian model, that village should be strengthened to remove the poverty and fulfill the aspirations of the people and make cities free from our crowd. In this regard, can you suggest or synthesize the two models, unorganized sector of economy and strengthening of the rural area?
Thank you. It's a very important question. We are dwelling on this question since the independence, that whether there can be a Gandhian kind of model or the westernized model of development. We opted for the westernized model, and we thought it is an essential model. There is no alternative of this model. We have pursued this model. That is the wrong direction, and that is why we are facing so many problems. because the people migrated from the villages to cities. Who are these people and why they have migrated? And now they reverse migration to the villages, what problems it will create. And not only here, but from the Middle Eastern countries, the poor people migrated to the Middle Eastern countries, and they were the main supplier of the foreign exchange to India, and they are coming back. And now in the Kuwait, there's a serious problem because nearly more than 1/3 of the Kuwait population are Indians, and now they are reducing it to the 15%. They will come back. So where we will be able to absorb them? So we shall have to create certain kind of opportunities at the local level, because the organized sector is very, very limited. The maximum contribution to the economy is of the unorganized sector, or the migrants in the developed countries. They are not sending much foreign exchange to India. The poor people migrated to the Arab countries. They are sending largest amount of foreign exchange to India. So they are the real Indians. They are helping India, not the people who migrated to the developed countries. They are settled there. They had initial education here. They are not, but we are emphasizing, we are trying to help them, the diaspora, we call the Indian diaspora in developed countries. And whenever our Prime Minister goes, he meets these people there. So everything is on the wrong footing. Our whole developmental process is on wrong footing. And even our knowledge structure is on wrong footing. Gandhi never used the term rural. When you look at the dictionary, what is the meaning of rural? It's a derogatory word. Villager can't be the rural. And Gandhi told it when the Asian Relations Conference took place in 1947. Gandhi came and addressed the leaders of Asia, Asian leaders in the Asian Relations Conference. And he told, what you are doing here, see the Indian villages, highly cultured and enlightened species of humankind. And we are saying they are the rural. How these people, highly enlightened and cultured species of humankind, when, according to Gandhi, can be rural? So not only our development structure, even our knowledge structure, our epistemology. Somewhere I wrote about the epistemological aspect. But still, we are dependent on the Western epistemology. We are having the same model, same knowledge exercises, same theories. We have practically ignored our own epistemology, through which we gain so much knowledge. When I talk of the indigenous epistemology, that does not mean the rituals and symbols and what's happening at the religious level. That is not the Indian epistemology. What I am saying is the South Asian epistemology. We should converge it with the Western epistemology. And then there can be the peaceful society. So I agree with you, our whole development model is on wrong footing unless or until you make the villages self-sufficient, village Swaraj. Gram Swaraj, what Gandhi used to call it. That not village Swaraj in the traditional parochial sense of the time. Village Swaraj means villages must have certain kind of resources, autonomy and management level. And they must contribute something to the national economy. They are already good. So villages should not be the subordinate to the cities. But right at the moment, what's happening is cities are the center of wealth, power and honor. Everything is in the cities. Gandhi never wanted it. Gandhi wanted the cities are the places of exchange of goods and services. They are not the center of power, wealth, and honor. That is so whole development model is on wrong footing. Relatively speaking, China has created different type of village system. They have developed a cluster of villages, and within that cluster, they have developed a small city. So suppose there is 20 villages, and in the center of these 20 villages, they have developed some kind of a city center. So all villages are having their exchange of goods and services in that way. So here, our whole development model itself needs certain kind of recorrection that should take place. And still, I feel the greatest contribution to the economy is the unorganized sector, and how severely the unorganized sector people, when they migrated back to their villages, they were treated. And that is why I told in my presentation, it has exposed the fragility of our system, fragility of our social civil society, fragility of our law, fragility of our policies, everything has been exposed. If there would have been some religious procession for the several days procession, there would have been tents at every nook and corner to provide all the basics, relief and food and shelter and everything to them. But nobody came forward to provide them some kind of help. But they are the backbone of our economy, backbone of the society. And this is the treatment we are giving. It is a shame on us. That's the only thing I can say. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. There is no longer now. It's 6. We have passed our maximum limit time. So before ending this thought-provoking session, I would like, by the name of Agenda for the Global South, to thank you, Professor Karori Singh, and we really owe you a special vote of thanks for accepting our invitation today. We really appreciate that you have joined and you have given us your time, and you were patient enough to answer all these questions. So thank you, Professor, and thank you all participants for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and looking forward for your participation in our next